Here we are. Thanks a lot for accepting this invitation and for joining us today. As I said, we will review his career turning point by turning point. And we have to start from the very beginning then. You arrived here in Seoul in 2009. And my first question is, what drew you here? What drew you to this city, both as a place to live, but also as a place to practice art criticism and curating? And since we start from the very beginning, what early moments made you decide you could build a meaningful career here?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me and congratulations on 100 of these events over 13 years. That's quite impressive. And thanks to everyone who's coming here and who's tuning in online and some friends and some new faces. Just to be clear about how long I've been here in Korea, I came originally in 2009. I lived here for 4 years and then I moved back to the United States for 5 years. And then I came back again to Korea in 2018. So it's been 11 years ish total that I've been here, but it hasn't been continuously since 2009. And when I first came here in 2009, I had just graduated from university. I had studied art history and had always planned to have a career in the art world. But of course, in 2008, we had the economic recession that started. And by 2009, it wasn't really resolved yet. And so, like many of my classmates in university, I sort of had to pivot and reassess where I was going and how I was going to get there. There were no real opportunities in the art world anymore in the United States for people just out of college, and so I ended up coming to Korea really through no intention of my own. I didn't really know much about Korea at all, let alone Korean art, but I had an opportunity to come teach at a university, teach English at a university, which is how so many people, foreigners, often do come here. And so that's how I arrived originally. And I was not in the art world at all. I was teaching at a university, not even in Seoul, about an hour and a half outside of Seoul. But that move was not career oriented at all. It was just survival oriented, and I was really hoping that Obama would figure out a way to fix everything and could get my career back on track. But unfortunately, after a year, that hadn't happened. And so I had to make a choice of to try to go back to the United States and enter the job market and find something one way or another, or to stay here and sort of see how things went. And I decided to stay here mostly because I had really, my eyes had been opened to the Korean contemporary art world. As I said, I really knew nothing about it before I came. And I was really quite astonished and amazed at how developed the art ecosystem was, even at that time, even in 2009. What it is today is gigantic and really robust and buzzing all year round. But back then, it was also really, really impressive and very exciting, especially as a young person. Yeah, I really enjoyed all those experiences that I had in the art world. But how I got sort of transitioned in my career was, in addition to teaching at the university, I was also tutoring some private students on the side, which any English teacher knows is another sort of survival tactic. And one of my students was the son of a very prominent curator named Sun Jung Kim. So I tutored her son for a while, and I ended up getting fired from that tutoring job. I think he had had like over 10 tutors in his life, and he was just over it. So we sort of parted ways. But I sent her an email after, and I said, I'm sorry it didn't work out with your son, but I'd really like to come, work for you if possible. I know what you've been doing is very impressive, and I'd love to learn whatever I can from you. Could I do a summer internship? And she was like, sure, you can come work for me for the summer. And it was a great summer because it was the summer of 2010, and that year she was the artistic director of Media City Seoul, the Seoul Media City Biennale. So I got to work on that project. Also, Haegyu Yang had a solo exhibition at Art Sonje Center, which is the museum that she was running back then and is still sort of very influential in curating. So I had a lot of great experiences, mostly working in sort of PR and communications. And, I was still only 23 years old. So that was sort of the extent of my use or value for her. But I really learned a lot and started to make some connections in the art world. And it was really a very crucial early experience that allowed me to get my foot in the door, um, and really learn more about what was happening here. Because then, as now, there wasn't really much information in English about Korean art and what was happening here. It was really hard to find for a guy like me who had no background in Korean language and wasn't familiar with the art scene. It's hard to find out about exhibitions, to learn about artists. The internet back then, Wikipedia was a much smaller sort of network than it is now. And so the only way to really acquire knowledge was to go out and see things for yourself. And so that's what I was doing from 2010 onward. And it wasn't really with a career in mind. It was just, you know, pure excitement and interest and curiosity. And so, that's sort of how things got started. And that was the beginnings of my experience in the Korean art world.
But also since the, let's say, the very beginning, you started writing about art. And how did you get into that? How did you get into writing?
Yeah, as I said, I studied art history in college, so I wrote a lot of papers in college about art. But I got my first paid article in fall of 2010. It was in this very, I don't think it's still in business anymore. It was an independent publication based in New York called M Magazine, and I met the editor while I was at Kiev that year in 2010. And he invited me to write like a roundup of Kiev and also Gwangju Biennale and Media City Biennale, which I, had been working for. And so I had a lot of knowledge about. And so, yeah, I wrote that piece, several pages. I'm not sure how good it really was, but didn't really seem to matter. It was just a great opportunity. Um, but it was really hard to get traction with like serious art publications at the time. As I said, I was like 23 years old, relatively inexperienced, full of ambition and very optimistic about what I might be able to do, but I was really unproven in terms of my skill set as a writer and my sort of context and perspective as a sort of commentator on visual culture in Korea and elsewhere. So I had written that one article, but what was really exciting at the time was I found myself surrounded by this very creative community in Seoul, primarily other expats, but also a number of Koreans, and they were artists and filmmakers and musicians and writers, and it was a really interesting and amazing time in all of our lives. We were all very young, but we were all really hustling and just making things happen instead of sort of waiting for opportunities to just land on our doorstep. Um, and it was sort of against this backdrop that I decided to start my own publication with a fellow expat. It was called Concrete Experience, and it was a journal of contemporary photography and creative writing. And I actually brought a copy here if anyone wants to see it later. And we published this in early 2011. And so, I was sort of the editor in chief of the magazine, and I wrote for it, but also there were a lot of submissions, and sort of it's a really interesting collection of 4 photographers and 11 writers. And so in the absence of any real opportunities with serious or real publications, I just decided to try something on my own. And following the publication of that, we had a launch party and an exhibition featuring the 4 photographers, and it was really well received amongst sort of my community. But at the time, I was invited, or somehow I managed to get accepted into this independent book fair called Unlimited Edition, which they're still doing today. It's now like in its 17th year, and it's held at the Buksema Museum in Nowongu. It attracts like thousands of people. It's a humongous event. But back then, it was just the third edition. So it's a much smaller thing. And yeah, somehow I got in. And I shared a table with a couple of graphic designers who were selling posters and other sort of printed matter, really interesting stuff. And one of them was actually also a writer. And she had just started working for this new magazine in Korea called Eloquence. Eloquence. And its tagline was International Creators Magazine. And so it was sort of through this chance encounter with this couple of graphic designers that I ultimately ended up getting a chance to write my first piece in Korea for this magazine, Eloquence. And the whole team was like very young. It was really amazing, and I'm still, in touch with a lot of those people, and some of them have gone on to actually accomplish quite amazing things in the sort of creative fields. But I became an editor at Eloquence. So I was this editor at this Korean magazine, responsible for like 5 contents every month, as well as commissioning writers. I was also the copy editor of the magazine. So I had a full plate of responsibilities. But it was a really great experience, despite it not really paying very well. But I was only able to get that job through this sort of random encounter, and sort of that only happened because I had sort of taken it upon myself, used my own money to print this publication in the first place. Um, so that was a really valuable experience, and that really helped me to initially establish myself as a writer. I was writing about artists, but also musicians and architects and curators, and it was an interview-based magazine, but I was also able to print one exhibition review every month, which was really the most meaningful thing for me. It was a great experience. I worked at the magazine for a while. The magazine has since sort of disappeared, but it was a really exciting and interesting project for a period of a few years.
While you were talking now, I wrote down somehow, chance, random. So many things happened by chance.
Mm,
But I think stories usually are full of those
of course.
sparks of chance. I'm pretty sure you also had some challenges along the way.
Right.
And if you can share with us, and which one was the biggest, for example, whether, I don't know, culturally, linguistically, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to note, first of all, that I've enjoyed a lot of privilege in Korea as an English speaker, as an American. There have always been plenty of opportunities to teach English here and make money that way. But it was never something that I was really passionate about, and certainly not, the reason why I came here. Um, but I always was teaching English because that was the only way I could legally stay here. And a lot of expats will also understand this sort of visa anxiety that many of us face. So I sort of found that a kind of teaching situation that I was able to tolerate. It was sort of an after school program, sort of like a hagwon for Korean people who know what that is, but it was sort of at an elementary school. It was very easy, very basic sort of job, and it allowed me to do my other work for Eloquence magazine on the side. And so that was the first challenge, was trying to balance everything, and also finding that job that wasn't taking all of my time. But another concern was also financial, and speaking candidly, was a big concern for many years. Writing about art is not a particularly lucrative endeavor, um, unfortunately, but that's the way the market is. Um, so writing was not a way to really survive financially, but it was a means to an end to develop my sort of set, to expand my understanding of Korean art and visual culture, and it was sort of starting to pay off in small but meaningful ways. And one way was the connections that I made through my work at Eloquence magazine. Um, and one of the first and sort of biggest in my memory was one day I got an email from the director of 1NJ Gallery saying, "Hey, I've been seeing this Eloquence magazine, and I really, respect what you're doing, and I'd love to meet with you sometime if you'd like to come in." And I was like, "Oh, this is amazing." 1NJ was a gallery that I was really interested in, had been going to a lot of shows and really admired. And I got there, and the guy who emailed me was this guy, Pat Lee, who was the director of 1NJ Gallery back then. Um, he's now my boss at Frieze. And so we met 15 years ago when he just emailed me to say, "Hey, I like what you're doing." Um, and so, another sort of chance that came just from doing work that I thought was important. And certain people began to recognize that. But at the end of those first 4 years, the challenges were just sort of too great for me to overcome. Korean culture was at a different level than it is now. For context, Gangnam Style came out in 2012, right? And that was this like cultural phenomenon, and that sort of put Korean pop culture on the map. But it was sort of considered like this, one-off sort of, one-hit wonder kind of thing. Korean culture was not this like global behemoth that it is now, and Korean art certainly was much smaller in terms of its scope in the international stage. And so I couldn't really see a way forward. I couldn't see a way toward a sustainable career here. You know, working for Eloquence magazine was not going to be a real career. And so in 2013, I sort of called it and decided to go back to the States and try to work there. So I moved to LA. I worked for a gallery in LA called Blum and Poe, which was a very interesting experience. It was a very big gallery, and I worked on a big exhibition of Tansekwa, which was the first major presentation of those artists like Park Seo-bo, Ha Chong-hyun, Yoon Hyung-gun. And that was sort of the beginning of the Tansekwa art market, you know, craze that started in 2014 and has continued, you know, quite strongly since then. Um, but after a while, I ended up moving on from that job and moved to New York to try to get back closer to Korea somehow, because I really missed that focus and that sort of uh, area. And you know, I felt like I had some expertise in that area that I wanted to sort of leverage in you know in my career. But New York was difficult as well. You know, it was hard to get any traction there because I'm competing with all these other people who have lived there. They went to college, went to NYU, and then they got internships in the city, and then they got this job and that job, and you know they've already been there for 8 years, and I just like showed up like, hey, I used to live in Korea. Uh, you think I can work here? And so that was really difficult. My accomplishments, my limited accomplishments in Korea, you know, it didn't really seem to translate to that job market. And so in 2016, Trump got elected. We're not going to go into politics here, but needless to say, that the United States changed a lot, and it was not a place I really wanted to live anymore. And so in 2018, I decided to move back here because I knew I could refocus on Korean art. I felt like it was a city and a country that I was comfortable living in, and I really missed it. And so when I came back in 2018, it was with more deliberate intention to really pursue this line of work as a critic and as a curator, and really you know come back in my 30s with a bit more perspective, a bit more maturity, and some real ambition and real goals. And so that's sort of when things restarted for me.
And let's say, and right after that, you started contributing to many international publications. Just to name a few: Art Asia Pacific, Art Review Asia, Frieze. How did that happen in this case? Or how did you build a connection to start writing for them?
Yeah, you know, so to begin with, I've been the sole editor of Art Asia Pacific since 2019. And as someone with a really clear focus on Korean art, it was always my dream to write for them ever since I lived here in my 20s. And that was, yeah, I always hoped I subscribed to the magazine, you know, and I just really admired what they were doing. It was a different time, and magazines were more sort of relevant in public discourse back then, print magazines. Um, but I couldn't write for them back then because I didn't have any credibility, and you know I was too young, arguably. You know, they wanted writers who had sort of proven themselves. But this is kind of a catch-22 because how do you prove yourself? How do you like establish a track record in publishing if a real magazine never sort of gives you a chance to get something published? And so it was really frustrating. Like, what do I have to do? Um, and so again, it just happened through a friend, through a connection. It was 2018. Every year, Art Asia Pacific publishes their almanac issue, which is sort of like an index of the art worlds in all the countries, like all the APAC countries that they cover. And although the format has changed a little bit since then, it comes out every January. It's different from the usual magazine content, and it's really sort of unique to Art Asia Pacific and really important to their sort of portfolio. And so they had a writer who had been doing it for them for many years, but for whatever reason, they weren't available. And the editor was sort of scrambling to find somebody. So he was asking people in Seoul that he knew for recommendations for writers. And so one of those people was the director of Whistle Gallery, named Kyungmin Lee. And apparently she recommended me to the editor. And he was like, let's give it a shot. You know, like we got no other
Okay.
no other option. So I got the commission. The deadline was like ridiculously short. It was like a week to write like 2,000 words about the whole previous year in the Korean art world. And I had only just moved back like 4 months before. So I was like researching. It was insane, but I got it. I hit the deadline. It was good enough to print apparently. And yeah, they needed somebody. I was sort of in the right place at the right time, but I also knew the right people. And Kyung Min at Whistle, I actually knew her from when she was a curator at 1NJ Gallery. So 1NJ is kind of like an important, uh, you know, node in this whole story. And after that, I started pitching to Artist Specific, and I started writing exhibition reviews for them more regularly. And after a while, I was looking at the masthead, and they had a Korea editor, but I noticed that she hadn't written anything for the magazine for like more than a year. So I sort of casually, nervously emailed the editor and I said, "Hey, is this person still working for you? Because I'm currently working for you and I want to keep working for you." Um, and he was receptive to the idea. And so I became the Korea editor of the magazine, and I'm still in that role. So that was how the Art Asia Pacific thing got started. Art Forum was a similar situation, but always like very tight deadlines, very small money, just hustling. But as I said before, it's that you have to get something under your belt, and so somehow or other I was able to make it work. And So that's how it all started. Eventually, magazines that I had never contacted started reaching out to me. The biggest one of these was Financial Times, who reached out to me a few years ago. And when that happened, I was like, oh, now people care about what I'm doing. And so I've written stuff for them for the past few years, which is very, validating for me as a writer to have this really, Artist Specific and Art Forum. These are like niche sort of, you know, trade publications, but Financial Times is a different story. And over the years, magazines have been asking me to write bigger and more meaningful like profiles and features, which is really my favorite thing to do. Writing exhibition reviews is interesting as sort of an exercise, but no one reads exhibition reviews. Like the artist mom, uh, the artist's girlfriend, boyfriend, husband, wife, and that's kind of no one else really. The magazines have pages and pages of exhibition reviews, but honestly, no one really. Well, maybe Raphael reads some of them, but no one reads an art magazine cover to cover. So doing these bigger pieces, going more in depth, and doing studio visits and meeting artists and having these longer conversations was really exciting. And this year, it really sort of went to a new level. And I did some really big stories. One was a profile of Suki Seogyeong Kang earlier this year. It was actually her last interview before she sadly passed away from cancer. And Lee Bull for Frieze, which was on the cover of Frieze magazine last month, which was a nice sort of coincidence that I also started my job with Frieze and totally unrelated. And I have a piece on Ayoung Kim coming out in Art Forum next month. And these are, really meaningful things for the artist, for me, I think for the whole Korean art scene, sort of lending my perspective and trying to add something to the existing discourse about these artists while not like taking a radically new, interpretation, but expanding, sort of the ways to think about their works, and sort of hopefully, yeah, being part of that sort of art historical conversation. Yeah.
And on a correlated but different level, because in this case it's more related to the audience, to let's say art lovers. You are also the founder of Seoul Art Friend. You founded that in 2018. Why did you do that? So was there something that was missing in the art scene?
Yeah.
Did you want to? Yeah.
So Seoul Art Friend, for anyone who doesn't know, is my social media handle. It's on Instagram primarily now. But actually, Seoul Art Friend, the genesis of Seoul Art Friend also started back in my 20s in 2011. There was a website kind of blog called Seoul Art Fiend at the time. And, I was always like scouring the internet for information about exhibitions. And this was one of the very, very few. There was like one other website in English that had content about Korean art. And it was this woman's, she was a teacher, English teacher, and it was sort of her personal blog about shows that she visited. And she also had some exhibition listings, but it was clearly like a side project for her. And so, yeah, I also just reached out to her one day and said, hey, can I write exhibition reviews and would you upload them? And she was like, dude, please, like, I can't pay you anything, but if you want to do it, like, I'd love to have more content. So I started, she probably thought I would like do one and like that would, she'd never hear from me again. But I wrote several reviews for her and she kept putting them up. And then she stopped doing the listings and she stopped making her own content in the summer of 2011. And so I contacted her and she said, actually, I moved back home. I moved back to Scotland. And I'm not really sure what to do with this website because I'm not planning to come to Korea anymore. So I said, well, you want to give me the website and I'll just keep it going? And she was like, I can't pay you anything, but but sure, yeah, go ahead. So I took over the website, Seoul Art Fiend, and immediately I resumed the exhibition listings, and that became sort of the main content because I saw that as a really important resource and sort of the main value proposition of that whole project. As a foreigner here whose Korean at the time was very limited, and there was no like place to find exhibitions. There was one website, Korean website called Neolook, and Koreans will know how terrible this website was. Very inefficient, difficult to use, and as a foreigner, just like impossible to figure out what anything was. And so I did the listings for that, and I left Korea and shut it down. But when I came back to Korea in 2018, that was one of the first things I did was to start Seoul Art Friend. And I changed the name because back in the old days, everyone thought it was Seoul Art Friend anyway. Like they thought it was like a typo or, it's so annoying and like, sort of presumptuous. It was actually Seoul Art Fiend. And like what fiend means. And it was just like, it was a whole thing. So Seoul Art Friend is just a much better name, much easier for everybody. And so, yeah, I restarted it, started doing the listings. And originally it was the website, soulartfriend.com, which had all the listings. And it was hundreds, like over 200 exhibitions every month. It was really quite a lot of research and work. And also I started Instagram as sort of a visual record of interesting exhibitions and really tried to take the best pictures I could. And then I also started a Facebook page, which I used to sort of like repost news stories about Korean art market, and things like this. So I had these like three sort of, verticals in my burgeoning media empire. And now it's just Instagram, because Instagram is really, I think, where most people are. And so the listings have also transitioned to Instagram. And so now instead of doing this comprehensive list of like every single exhibition in Seoul, which is not really useful to anybody because how do you know what's actually worth going to? Which galleries are even like legitimate galleries? Now every week I post up 7 exhibitions that are opening that week that I sort of like endorse, so to speak. But none of it's paid. It's all like actual, actually my taste and exhibitions that I think are important. And admittedly, now that I've started my new job at Frieze House, Seoul Art Friend has been a little bit neglected recently, but there are plans to get everything restarted again, and also sort of expand that community and really bring more people into it. So it's not just me, but sort of giving credibility to the name Seoul Art Friend and making it more of like a embracing sort of community. So stay tuned for that. But yeah, to your question, I think there's always been, for me as a foreigner, a real lack of information, as I've said numerous times, about the art scene here, about Korean artists. And so, yeah, I think this is one small thing that I can do, and hopefully it makes some kind of impact. I think it's also beneficial for the Korean audience. Most of my followers on Instagram are Korean or live in Korea. And so I've started to post things in Korean and English just to, acknowledge that readership. But there are other sort of micro influencers in the art field, and we're also doing slightly different things. And this is sort of the niche that I've carved out, and I'm happy with it. And I think it really supports the galleries and supports the whole art scene in a meaningful way. And yeah, I've gotten some quite good feedback from it over the years.
And going back to the writing, as I mentioned at the beginning, in 2024, you published Future Present Contemporary Korean Art, which is there and available. Then we will share later on where the catalog is also available for you to buy in case you're interested. It's a very good catalog because you surveyed 25, right? 25 millennial, so young Korean contemporary artists. What was the process to put that massive catalog together? And what impact would you like that catalog to have,
Sure.
both here and abroad?
Yeah, I mean, I literally gave a whole talk about this in June at the Korea Society, which sort of talks about the themes and sort of the purpose of the book. So I won't get into all that. Let's try to give a little bit more kind of in the scene stuff here. But first, I think is the motivation to focus on millennial artists, which was that in 2025 or 2024 when the book was published, millennial artists are in their 30s and early 40s and are really in a position in their careers where they've established themselves. They've developed their vision. They're confident in what they're doing, and the work they're producing is actually not just relevant but also significant in terms of the art historical impact. They're no longer emerging artists. They're really fully fledged contemporary artists, but they weren't really getting the the recognition that I thought they deserved. Sort of the Gen X artists were still really dominating the art scene, and it's not just I think it's everywhere. But I'm also a millennial myself, and so is sort of my own ego also kind of involved in this as someone who has felt kind of overlooked for a long time as a writer. But these artists are really, really, important. The work they're doing is really relevant. It sort of speaks to universal themes, and I think it really is the future of Korean art, but it's also the present of Korean art. And so the title Future Present sort of alludes to that. And many of these artists I also knew personally, or all of them basically. I've been going to their exhibitions for years and years and years. And, I saw them as my sort of peers in some way. And so I wanted to put them in a book. There have been plenty of books that written spotlighting these Gen X artists and even baby boomer artists, and we all know those names, and they're all wonderful artists in their own right. But it was really time, I thought, for these artists to be recognized. And so the millennial generation is roughly from 1980 to 1991. But it's arbitrary, honestly. It's all subjective, right? So I sort of stretched it a little bit to include a few artists born in the late 1970s who I saw as kind of leaders of the millennial generation, as opposed to like the trailing edge of the baby boomer generation. So that was sort of the generational framework. And the second thing was working with an overseas publisher, an international publisher, as opposed to a Korean publisher, because it was really important that this book get international distribution. It would have been a lot less painful and a lot cheaper to print it here in Korea, a lot faster. But I knew that if I did that, it would just be stuck here in Korea and it would never reach the audience that it was intended for. And so I worked with a publisher in Italy called Skira, and they did a beautiful job printing the book. And yeah, very happy with how it turned out. It's kind of the motivation and the reasoning behind those two choices. I also decided to not adhere to any sort of overarching like thematic framework, having some title that is maybe more evocative than future present, but that sort of implies some kind of commonality in terms of the theme or concept, because I didn't want to sort of put these artists in a box that they didn't necessarily feel applied to them. So by adopting this generational framework, it's really the most sort of objective way to bring all these artists together. They're just all born around the same time, within the same sort of 13, 14 years. And so that was very important to me, not to assert anything from like a critical perspective, but really to let them speak in their own words, on their own terms. And of course, I've written, short essays about each artist, about aspects of their practice, whether it's the methodology or the conceptual framework, or the themes that they deal with. But each one is different, and I sort of want them to be all different and recognized as such. The next thing was selecting the artists, which I think everyone is sort of, curious how I did that. And it wasn't like by committee or anything like that. It was a long process over more than a year, of putting together lists and, scratching people out and adding people in and going to an exhibition and be, oh, how could I totally forgot about this person, and back in. And in the end, I ended up with 25 artists, and I wanted to cut it at 25, because I wanted to give each artist as many pages as possible. So each artist has my essay on one page and then 7 pages of images. And in the sort of comparable books about Korean artists, and even about, these sort of survey books, about artists from other countries or other generations, most of them do not have such a large number of pages for each artist. And I really wanted to include as many images as possible. So 25 was sort of the limit that I could do with this size of book. And then finally, it was sort of making sure there weren't too many overlaps. And so whether that's the medium, right? So there's like 11 painters in the book, which is more than any other mediums. I think 5 sculptors, 5 or 6 video artists. But that's really because that's sort of, representative of the demographics of the Korean art world. There are more painters than any other uh, type of artists in Korea. And so I wanted to sort of be a cross section in as many ways as possible. And then it was making sure that we didn't have artists that sort of conflicted with each other in terms of the issues they were dealing with. And in the end, it ended up being, I think, like 80% women artists, which was not intentional at all, but that's also representative of the Korean art world as well. There's a lot more women artists than men artists, and I think that's also internationally the case as well. And as a foreigner, sort of introducing these Korean artists, I sort of had this worry that it would be seen as this kind of, colonial or, sort of very arrogant, assertion that like I know what Korean art is, and so to sort of counterbalance this, I commissioned essays from 2 Korean curators who are also millennials, who actually grew up in the 90s and 2000s, and who sort of lived the same experience as these artists. And so those essays in the book really ground it in the technological and economic and social conditions that they all grew up with, and that have influenced their sort of worldview and how these artists think about the world that we live in today. And then finally, I also worked with a Korean designer based here in Seoul, who's also millennial. So I was millennial, the artists are millennials, the 2 curators are millennials. We were all millennials who made this book, and I'm very proud of that. And it was very important to work with a Korean designer who also knew these artists, who also had experience doing catalogs for them in the past. And so in the end, yeah, I'm very proud of how the book turned out. I think it's having a significant impact. I mean, if sales are any indication, it came out last summer, and the book was all sold out by the end of last year. So we did a reprint. We updated the artist's CVs and made some small tweaks, and so we did as a second edition earlier this summer. So now it's available again and should be available for the foreseeable future. My priority now is to get this book in as many like university libraries and major art institution libraries around the world, because I do see it as sort of like a academic resource, or it will be in the future. I think, this is a very important and exciting moment in Korean art history and in the Korean art world, with Frieze coming, with the market, with Tansekwa, with all these things sort of expanding and growing time. And so I think looking back on this moment, I hope that this book will sort of be an important or useful resource for researchers, for students, teachers, and collectors, enthusiasts, what have you, to really learn about, what this moment was like in Korea in the art world.
Thank you. We will cut short a bit the interview because I think it's interesting to also to hear the question coming from the audience. Just one more,
Fine.
one more. No, one more, which is quickly though. Your last appointment as director of House Frieze Seoul. How did that came
Frieze
about?
House Seoul. Yeah.
Sorry, Frieze House Seoul. How did that came about?
Yeah. So starting last month, I became director of Frieze House Seoul. Frieze House Seoul is a permanent exhibition space in Seoul operated by Frieze, which is the art fair company that has fairs in Seoul, also London, New York, Los Angeles, and starting next year in Abu Dhabi. Frieze also has a similar permanent exhibition space in London called Number 9 York Street, which they've been running for about 4 years. And it is a space that serves the main client base of the Frieze Art Fair, which is the galleries that exhibit. And so it's a place that these galleries can rent out to do a temporary pop-up remote exhibition in Seoul. It takes a lot of the work out of finding a venue and staffing the venue and figuring out the custom, the shipping. And so we don't take care of everything, but because we do run this huge art fair, we have all these vendors that we already work with, and it's really a seamless process for galleries who may not have the capacity to figure out all these things. But in terms of my role there, and how it all happened, I always, had this desire to run an art space in Seoul, but I could never quite put all the pieces together to realize that dream or goal, you might say. I had done consulting work for several galleries in Korea, domestic galleries and international galleries. But that jump from a support role to a leadership role was something that I just couldn't figure out how to get there. And from the outside, I think it may have seemed like I had reached this point of stability in my career. Now I was getting these bigger commissions from magazines. I had, curated a bunch of shows. I had a successful book. But it was still quite precarious because it was all freelance, and that's, yeah, I'm almost 40, and that's a scary place to be in terms of planning for your future. So when Frieze House Seoul was announced in April, May, and the director job opened up, I was, immediately interested and really hopeful that I could sort of leverage all my accumulated knowledge and experience and sort of realize this ambition to take the helm of an art space here in Seoul. And just like all my previous, experiences and opportunities, this sort of opened up thanks to all the hard work over many, many years, putting myself in a position through my writing and my curating, and also the relationships that I had built here in Seoul. I think that was a key part of why I got the job, was my credibility and my network here in Seoul. Also, Pat is the director of Free Seoul, and we've known each other for 15 years. We never really worked together on a major project. I always wished that we would be partnered up at some point in our career. But just because I knew Pat, it didn't make it a foregone conclusion that I would get the job. It was a very rigorous and long application process, and I'm very grateful and honored to be trusted with this position and be leading Frieze House into the future. And we'll have year-round programming, exhibitions with mostly international galleries, but we're also doing projects with Korean curators and foundations and other interesting organizations in the art world, in addition to public programs, talks, screenings, book launches. We're sort of envisioning it as sort of a house of culture and a home for creatives here in Seoul. It just so happens to be run by Frieze, but it's not really affiliated with the fair business at all. It's its own entity. And it's very exciting. I hope you all visit at some point. It's located in Yaksu, between the Shilla Hotel and Yaksu Station, Shindangdong area near the old Seoul City Wall. It's a beautiful house with a great garden, really interesting space. We just closed our first exhibition, which was very successful, a big group show of queer artists, and we're looking forward to bringing a full slate of programs next year, as we sort of work toward occupancy and bringing as many people through as possible. So stay tuned for that. You can get more information on the Frieze website.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. we end here the first part. And we now open to the Q&A.